Hey guys, this is Nathaniel Whittemore, and you are listening to the What is Crypto podcast.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to the What is Crypto podcast with your boy, Nye. My name is Matthew Aaron, and I produce the show. This next guest, I started following a couple years ago, I think. And I got to him because everybody in the crypto space was talking about him. They were saying what good work he does. Look at this tweet that he makes. You have to follow him and you have to do his long reads. And ever since then, I've noticed that this guy, every Sunday, without fail, puts out an amazing, extensive, exhaustive list of things to look at in tech, in crypto, from a whole swath of different aspects. They're called his Sunday long reads, and his name is
Nathaniel Whittemore.
So we wanted to have him on the show to talk about making great content. Because if the biggest names in crypto are talking about his content that he's putting out on Twitter, then who's a better person to ask about making great content? Well, that's what we're going to talk about. If you have a Twitter feed, if you have a YouTube channel, if you have an Instagram, or even getting into TikTok, you want to have your content be good. And I hope that talking to Nathaniel, we can figure out what makes good content. And it might not be the good content of, for all aspects. But if some of the most respected people in the crypto space is saying that his content's good, let's see what it's all about. Now, before we get into that, like I always say, help us out. Write us a good comment. Go to iTunes, click the comment button, and say what you got to say. Good, bad, suggestions, praises, I don't care. Just want to see it up there. I would really appreciate it. Now, without further ado, let's talk to Nathaniel. We'll see you after the show.
What is your full name and your title?
I am Nathaniel Whittemore, and I do not have a title.
How would you describe yourself?
The road answer is an independent strategy and communications consultant for crypto companies and an independent media creator.
This question, how do you use crypto in your daily life, is sponsored by BMag. BMag.io. BMag, they write stories that inform, influence, and inspire the global blockchain cryptocurrency community.
What's going on, guys? All right, so this question, how do you use crypto in your daily life? And how would you like crypto used in the future in your daily life? So I actually don't particularly stress about the crypto in my daily life. For me, it's a way to both opt out of systems that I don't like and opt into a future that I'm more interested in, right? So crypto isn't necessarily a daily life thing for me. It doesn't need to be. It doesn't need to fill that function. I will say I'm excited intellectually about all the different ways that people are enabling you to use your crypto now without selling your crypto, right? That is a major and meaningful trend that I think is valuable, but it just doesn't impact me very much. Now, one exception to this is I do consulting with crypto companies, right? I do communications and brand messaging and narrative and content marketing for crypto companies. And payment in crypto is in a lot of ways radically easier and faster and more efficient than being paid through traditional means. So that's one way that it's not exactly daily, but it's certainly a valuable differentiated use case. When it comes to how do you want crypto to be used in the future in your daily life, again, it's really about the larger system for me, not so much the day-to-day use case, which frankly is a position of privilege, right? That's not the case for a lot of the folks for whom I think crypto is more essential. Crypto is more life or death. Crypto allows them to get around capital controls and unfair regimes and all manner of things. So, I feel lucky to be in a place where crypto doesn't have to be in my daily life in terms of how I use it. It's a bet on a different future.
And now, back to Michael and his guest. Enjoy the rest of the show.
Now, let's dive into the ideas of making great content. So I've been following you for a while on Twitter. I like what you put out, man. You always got some good things. And something unique that you actually really do, which I found very unique and creative when I first saw it, was your idea of the long reads. You've kind of made this platform of Twitter that's very focused on quick, easy, digestible content. And you found a way to actually deliver large amounts of value while also staying in the same format as the platform. How did you kind of come up with this idea to begin with?
I mean, it was interesting. I think so. It was inspired by the medium itself, which is why I think it feels kind of authentic to the medium in this case being Twitter. And I was noticing just what a high percentage of really interesting thoughts were coming through, Twitter threads or discussions that happened on Twitter, right? And I think that part of that is because it is because Twitter's so ephemeral and fleeting, people feel more comfortable testing out untested ideas than they would even in something like a blog post, which still isn't like super high stakes, but it feels like it's a lot higher stakes than something like Twitter. And so you're seeing, when I started LRS in particular, tons of people who were, we were in the middle of a bear market, or I guess we were kind of just like recognizing it at that point, but practically we were in the middle of a bear market, and people wanted to explore different things. They were still trying to figure out how to make sense of the ICO boom that had just passed. They were trying to figure out what was going to happen next with Bitcoin. And again, the Twitter thread was a really prominent format. And so, I started playing around with this. I did a bunch of kind of thread of threads on individual topics. And then one Sunday I was sitting in bed actually and was like, I really want to do a thread of threads on something interesting this week, but there's no like one topic that I'm really zoning in on. So maybe I'll just try to do kind of like a narrative history of the week as it happened with the most interesting content that I saw, and let people discover it that way. And it totally hit right from the get-go. So that was like almost 70 weeks ago now, and just got feedback that people liked it. I mean, it's been interesting because it is really reflective, I think, in some ways of the content medium that is native to a particular platform, in the sense that it works for people really well because it is so designed it's designed around what Twitter can do really well, which is, really pack in a lot of information that can send you down a rabbit hole if you want to dig in, but you can also just skim on the top of it, like a rock skipping across a pond if you want. And so that's been really cool. The problem is it's also subject to the same forces that are much larger than any one piece of content on a medium. And since I started doing that, there's been a huge rise in kind of scammy Twitter threads in other parts of the site. So this isn't crypto at all, but like there's constantly like diet pill threads where people like, it starts off like it's going to be some inspiring story, but it's just someone shilling some stupid weight loss program and having a million bots tweeted. And because of that, I found thread engagement in general go way down. So, it's still a medium that I love and I think is interesting, but I think, you have to understand when you're making a bet on a platform that the platform can change. Simple tweaks to the algorithm can make huge differences in terms of your audience and your engagement.
And how did you keep up with that content for 70 weeks, man? I'm able to tweet every single day, but it comes at random times. It comes at many times very disorganized and not structured at all. How were you able, and how are you still able to keep this going after 70 weeks? Same format, same structure, same kind of like organization to it.
So it's a couple parts. One is I figured out like a process that worked for me to basically tag high potential things, like things that I thought were interesting, even if I couldn't really process them yet, right? So like throughout the week, I'll use Pocket to tag every single article that I think might be, or any piece of content that I think is interesting for long reads, and then I won't go back and really review it until like Friday and start writing it Saturday. So that's one part. It's just practically, even though I'm not full attention on it, I can kind of be keeping track of it throughout the week. The second piece, though, is just that, the stuff that I get paid for is working with companies to help them understand how their narrative and the story that they're telling about their company is going to interact with larger market narratives. And so what I mean by that is that like at any given time in crypto, there's this kind of constant back and forth battle for what the mainstream thinks about new protocols, new platforms, new exchanges, what you should prioritize, right? There's these market narratives that kind of are constantly shifting, but they are a force and they exist. And so when a company comes and they're trying to market into those narratives, you can run into them. You can say, hey, we agree with this new emerging narrative, and we're going to really play that up and cite ourselves as an example of this thing. You can go against it. You can say the dominant narrative is wrong and we're offering this alternative. Either of those can be good strategies, but what's a bad strategy usually is not understanding how your story as a company is likely to interact with what people already believe in the market. So that's kind of like my job is to help companies with that and then help produce content that tells those stories. And so it's kind of imperative that I'm keeping track of the inflows and outflows of ideas and narratives and debates and stuff anyway. So they kind of go hand in hand a little bit.
And I like what you said in the beginning, man, because you're talking about how Twitter is kind of become a medium for people to test things, even a little bit more than blog posts and other forms of content, Facebook posts, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, Twitter's easiest. It's not only easiest to test things on because it's such a short format, but it's also easiest to judge and gauge reactions off of and things like that because of the way that the platform is built, with the way the content's structured and the simplicity that people can respond and like to things. How was the engagement in the very first few times that you were making these posts, and how did you switch your strategy, or kind of maybe not even switch your strategy, but how did you evolve over time with the content you were putting out?
I think that it's almost like just kind of appreciating that it was never going to stay exactly the same. And so what I mean by that is, like, when I first started doing these thread of threads, like basically no one was doing that yet. And it's become a much more common thing. It's just like kind of a tool in the toolkit. When I first started doing it, everyone would retweet when they were featured in it because it was new, it was novel, right? And that was kind of a big part of how it got attention and why the Twitter algos liked it at the beginning. Now people are, you have your stuff referenced in tweet storms regularly, and it's not as novel, and so you don't get that same, like, the default isn't to press a button. And so I think for me that there's been a couple different evolutions. One is part of what I think what makes people like Long Read Sunday is that there really is like a narrative arc to it. Like, it's not just a list of like the most important links with a sentence about them. It's really like, this is what happened over the week. This is the story as I saw it. Like the one that I just put out this morning was actually, this week was the first week that I've ever been late on it. I did it on Monday instead of Sunday. Clearly I'm falling behind, but it was like, it felt really clear to me that last week, like, the story was this battle that always exists in crypto, but it felt extra last week, of the old versus the new, right? And you had this debate in the Bitcoin circles about whether institutionalization of Bitcoin meant the kind of end to censorship resistance, and how important was censorship resistance to the foundations of Bitcoin, right? There's this kind of old versus new. Like, can the old power structure adopt this without compromising what makes it so novel? Then you had Libra and the central banks, right, which has been just an overarching story. But again, there was some extra bits of that last week, as you had the Bank of International Settlements coming in with this report on stable coins and things like that. So I think that the part of what I've tried to do to sustain interest in it is, like, in the absence of people just like as a default thing pressing retweet on anything that anyone tags them in, you have to make it valuable in a different way. So that's been one part. I mean, the other part is expanding it to other mediums and starting to try to figure out where you can own your own list. So there is an email that comes out for LRS as well, and it started actually less about protection against changes in Twitter's algorithm, and more about the fact that there's just some people who are not going to be on Twitter enough to catch it, or prefer to have it in their inbox. And so that's kind of what I started for. But as things have changed, it's been really valuable to have spent lots of months now on that as well. So I think it's just like any time spent kind of lamenting how engagement used to be, or how the algorithms used to promote things, is probably better spent figuring out how to keep evolving with the medium, or deciding that you need to move off the medium and invest elsewhere.
And how did this content change for you when you were in a bear market? I guess, how did the engagement change for you first? And then when you saw engagement possibly changing, lowering, etc., did you change the content at all? Or did you just stick the course and choose to create the same kind of organization and content?
So it started in bear market, and obviously it got worse. So, like, it started last year in June, basically, I think. So June 2018 is when LRS was the first LRS week. And so it was already pretty bearish then. It got worse. Obviously, it got a lot worse for a while. I think the interesting thing is that when it comes to long form content, and even the idea of a long reads, there is way more, there may be fewer total people who are engaging with content during a bear market, but the people who are there tend to be willing to engage more deeply with longer forms of content, right? So I've seen this too in the shift, like, around the strategies that I deploy with clients, when a lot of the emphasis we would have been on doing things like essays and big thought pieces. Whereas now, a lot of the times what I'm thinking about is, there an opportunity for something really novel and different that's kind of more multimedia, like, should we be thinking about like like a podcast? Like, what should we be doing that's a little bit more suited to kind of faster attention? And we're kind of in this like weird media market right now where it's not exactly bear. It's, you certainly can't call it a bear given how much Bitcoin is up over the course of the year, but it's not exactly like a bull with lots of enthusiasm either. It's just kind of like there's a every like 6 to 8 weeks there's a reset of some price that we just hover at for a while. So that's a weird kind of place for content. You know, you have high volatility and there's obviously like a ton of people who are engaging, but again, it's around like shorter stuff. You want the patented pomp and rhythm trader pump pieces at that time, and those guys do like an amazing job of hitting what their audiences want with that. But then, you know, when it gets bad, it's better suited for other types of content. So it's kind of a moving target, I think. And to some extent, you know, I do believe that if you're a content creator, you also just have to be comfortable with what your natural medium is, and you can move around within it. I think people can change, people can do multiple things, but like if something feels inauthentic to you, you're never going to be able to do it. It would be so weird if I just started doing this sort of the catchy one tweet, pithy, like think about how amazing Bitcoin is for this reason. And it's not even that I don't like those. It's just not what I do. I'm actually a very like stupidly long-winded, as you can probably tell listening to this. And so Twitter is already like kind of a weird medium for me. And things like LRS are just me trying to impose my long-windedness on it. So I don't know. I think that you kind of got to work with what you got a little bit, almost regardless of the context.
I agree, man. I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of those posts, but I'm also not a hater either. But I think with content in general, you need to be able to take both sides. But I think like the biggest problem I see when I see like people on Twitter talking about things is like you need to be able to talk about the good and the bad. You know, people need to see both sides of the coin in order to get the most information possible for them to make their own opinion and make their own judgments.
Yeah, and I mean, listen, for me too, like part of it is also how you see yourself. Like we don't really have like journalists and non-journalists anymore. We have this like weird spectrum of like the characteristics that used to be exclusive to journalists in terms of trying to be objective. If you go back, I don't know what, 25, 30 years, and you thought about people who are in the knowledge or information business, you had like marketers, you had academics, and you had journalists, right? So marketers are pumping a certain narrative, a story, because they're trying to sell you something. And by the way, those have become dirty words, but they're not, right? This is just the way that ideas are spread. There's always people behind them who really believe in them, right? It's the same with political marketers who are trying to tell the story of, their vision of their candidate or their policies or whatever, right? So you have that marketing set. Then you have academics who theoretically are kind of explaining big patterns of the world. And they're not necessarily in the fray of daily news or whatever, but they have a position and they use structured research and evidence to support that. And then finally, you have journalists who are theoretically trying to provide objective facts about the things that happened and potentially why, without superimposing upon them their own biases or predispositions. Although we can debate how able people were actually ever to do that. But now you have just this weird mixture where when everyone is an independent content creator, in some ways an independent voice, they all have different agendas, right? And so, some people see it like their job is they are the front lines of the Bitcoin marketing operation, which is, telling that story. And part of that is like the way that it pays dividends is in the percentage of Bitcoin being held and, all this sort of stuff. So I think that you can very reasonably want way more constructive debates and kind of interesting deep dive content while still understanding that those folks have a specific role that they're playing. And that's kind of where I find myself. Like, I tend to agree with what you just said in terms of wanting, if there could always be like substantive discussions between like people who disagreed, but like didn't have to be disagreeable on Twitter, like that would be amazing. I don't think it's realistic, but that's kind of what I get to do with LRS and with the Crypto Daily 3 at 3 video and podcast that I've been doing as well, is choose to highlight discussions that are really doing that, right? Like last week, I was telling you, or what I was mentioning earlier, there's this debate about, institutionalization in Bitcoin. And sometimes tempers got a little heated, but by and large, it was a conversation that I felt was, if you were just following along, not even participating, you were going to learn so much more from that than the average, crypto Twitter dust up or whatever, because of just, it's such an important question that has real impact, and different people can have like really different perspectives on, whether sound money principles or censorship resistance is the most important feature of Bitcoin, or whether there is even a most important feature, whether it's a combination of features. So I think that for me, the goal is always to just do what I can to highlight the stuff that I think is going to make the most significant impact in how people learn and how they learn to think about this whole space.
And why the space, man? Like, the way I want to really wrap this up is, like, for you, why did you choose this? Why did you choose Bitcoin, cryptocurrency? What was like the thing that you looked at? You said, wow, I'm really drawn to that.
Well, it's interesting. I kind of had, before getting into this space, I had two like distinct parts of my professional life. The first was all about social impact. And so, as I was mentioning before, I thought I was going to work in either war zones or post-conflict zones, figuring out kind of rehabilitation or, peace or whatever. And so I spent most of my undergraduate going to the places that I thought I was going to work. I lived in Cairo on and off like a dozen times over the course of 6 years. I spent a ton of time in East Africa. I spent a lot of time in other parts of the Middle East. And I ended up building this program center at my university to send kids all over the world and go experience these things. And through that, I ended up finding my way to start working with a company called Change.org when it had just started. And it was grown into now a pretty big, significant global organization with, hundreds of employees and a really interesting footprint. But the secondary effect of starting to work with Change when it first started was that I moved out to San Francisco and I got kind of pulled into the world of technology. And at that time, this is like 2007, 2008 that I started going out there. And it's hard to remember now, but Web 2.0, when it originally started, it was this theoretically incredibly empowering, disruptive force where instead of just being passive consumers of content, which is what Web 1.0 was about, everyone got to create now, right? You had Blogger and WordPress starting. You had, before he started Twitter, Evan Williams was trying to build a podcast platform called Audio, which we are actually testing out one summer that we were doing all this kind of around the world crazy stuff. And so the idea that people could create things different and that, intermediaries were changing and that people's voices were going to get louder was really palpable. Now, fast forward a decade and the legacy of the Web 2.0 movement has, on the one hand, certainly been some amount of that transformation and who gets to be a media presence, who gets to be a content creator. And I think we're obviously all benefiting from that. But the second part of the legacy is the fact that the social networks that underpin the biggest platforms created some of the most powerful monopoly lock-in that we've ever seen. And that's not resolved yet, right? Like Mark Zuckerberg is going to testify in front of Congress on Wednesday, not just about Libra, I imagine, but about kind of the hugeness of Facebook and the responsibility, whatever, right? Like these are massive questions. So anyways, it was exciting and dynamic when I got there, but I realized that over the course of a few years, I'd gotten so kind of drawn into just the day in, day out of consumer technology, which is really just a game of who can win VC money and then who can win retail consumer interest for a while, that I didn't realize that I was incredibly bored with it. And it actually took leaving San Francisco to kind of snap out of it a little bit. And after I left San Francisco, when I started looking around, I had just a lot of people who were starting to find their way into blockchain projects, into cryptocurrency projects, into Bitcoin. And again, I guess the thing that's notable too is that in San Francisco, the Bitcoin story was all about payments, right? It was another option at Square. It was like another way to buy coffee for your investor meeting at Coupa Cafe in Palo Alto, which was just like super boring, frankly. And that obviously this is a filter failure of my own. Like there were communities there at that time, I know, who were talking about a very different side of Bitcoin, but from a dominant narrative perspective in that city, that's what it was about. So interestingly, it really wasn't until I left and when I started looking at Bitcoin and crypto not as a technology per se, or not exclusively as a technology, but I almost started looking at it in the context of all of those things that had gotten me into social impact before, right? So the early part of my professional life rather than the kind of mainstream San Francisco part of my professional life. And once I had that reframing, that's kind of what really pulled me down this proverbial rabbit hole and thinking about it in terms of its significance as a transformational force in terms of just big patterns of human history, right? Like the fact that every government in the world right now is rapidly trying to figure out what it needs to do around digital currency and trying to evaluate the potential threat of a private company creating a currency that's pegged to a basket of currencies that may be more popular than their own currency for citizens. These are, from a historian's kind of perspective or a historical perspective, are incredibly powerful, dynamic like interesting unresolved forces. So that, I mean, for me, it's kind of like why crypto is like, once I got in, it's like, how could you do anything else? Like, I can't even imagine going back and doing, marketing to help Verizon think about how to sell a new phone, which is like one of the last things that I was doing before this, So it's hard to get out once you've got in, is kind of my feeling.
That's the damn truth, bro. It's the damn truth. It hooks you, man.
Indeed.
Awesome, brother. Well, I appreciate you coming on the show today. Thanks for chatting a little bit.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me. I like being able to go kind of behind the scenes on the content process. And I do think, I mean, it's one of the things that I think is also very cool about crypto. And I encourage, anyone who's thinking about creating content or whatever, is that I really believe that in addition to all the other transformative stuff we're seeing, it is kind of on the front lines of what media looks like in the future, in the sense that, there are individuals who have as much media presence as, basically any except the biggest crypto publications, right? Like the influence is not just around kind of traditional publications or traditional anything, right? And it's still really blue oceans and green fields when it comes to who's going to shape the stories in crypto and how independent content producers are going to be. So it's fun chatting about it. And I encourage anyone who's out there being like, I really feel like I have something to say, but I feel like there's too much content already. I would say ignore that feeling and see if you can find your niche.
I love it, bro. Agreed, man.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the What is Crypto podcast with your boy, Nye. And Nathaniel, thank you very much for coming on the show. It's great to meet you. Your DYOR today is not much of a DYOR or do your own research, but a kind of suggestion. And I don't know how many people know that this exists. Now, at one point, I didn't know that these existed, but I currently use Buffer. So does Michael Nye. I actually used to use Hootsuite, and Michael told me he likes Buffer better. So I tried that one, and now I'm kind of using that one. Honestly, I kind of like Hootsuite a little better. Anyway, long story short, is if you have a Twitter feed and you want to put out a lot of content and you think that it's a very hard or a very tedious thing to keep remembering to open up your Twitter and writing a tweet, you can sit down in the morning while drinking your coffee and write as many tweets as you want and schedule them throughout the day, throughout the days, throughout the weeks, or even the months. So they just pop up there without you even doing anything. So your DYOR is if you are one of those people that didn't know these existed, which maybe everybody does. Maybe I was always late to the game, only got mine hooked up about 1.5 years ago. Look into it. Look into these ways to schedule your social media so you can start building your social media presence and making that great content. Anyway, thank you very much for listening to the show, and we'll see you in future episodes of the What is Crypto podcast with your boy Nye.